Some doors are never meant to be opened, and yet fate always finds the trembling hand willing to touch the handle. The storm descended over Blackwood County like a living creature, swallowing the narrow roads beneath sheets of snow and freezing rain. Wind screamed across the empty hills, bending the pine trees until their dark branches scraped against one another like bones in the night. Elena Vale pulled her worn wool coat tighter around herself as she hurried down the icy street beside the train station, her boots slipping against the frozen cobblestones. The small leather suitcase in her trembling hand felt heavier with every passing minute. She had nowhere left to go. Only 3 hours earlier, the Barton family had informed her they no longer required a governess. The position she had traveled nearly 200 miles to accept had vanished with a single polite apology and a sealed envelope containing barely enough money for another week of lodging. "We are terribly sorry, Miss Vale. Circumstances have changed." Circumstances. Such a small word to ruin a woman's life. Snow clung to Elena's dark hair and melted against her pale cheeks as she reached the edge of the nearly abandoned station road. Most of the shops had already shuttered their windows against the worsening weather. The street lamps flickered weakly through the storm, casting long golden shadows over the whitened ground. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang 6 times before vanishing beneath the howl of the wind. Elena stopped beneath the awning of a closed bakery, breathing hard as cold seeped through her gloves and into her bones. She could not afford another hotel. She could not return home. There was no home anymore. Her father's death had taken the last of their savings, and the creditors had wasted little time claiming the small Connecticut house where she had spent her childhood. Now the storm stretched endlessly around her like a punishment from God himself. Then she saw it. A black carriage waiting across the road, its lanterns glowing faintly through the swirling snow. Relief hit her so suddenly it nearly weakened her knees. The Bartons must have reconsidered. Or perhaps another employer had sent transportation after all. Desperation silenced caution. Elena hurried across the street, nearly stumbling as wind tore violently at her coat. Her fingers shook as she reached for the brass handle and pulled the carriage door open. Warmth greeted her first, then silence. Elena froze instantly. A man sat across from her beneath the dim amber light of the carriage lantern, one gloved hand resting against a polished cane. He was tall even while seated, broad-shouldered beneath a dark wool overcoat, his sharp features partially hidden by shadow. But his eyes, cold gray and steady, locked onto hers with such unsettling calm that her breath caught painfully in her throat. For one terrible second, neither of them moved. The carriage door slammed shut behind her as thunder rolled across the distant hills. Elena's voice faltered. "I believe I made a mistake." The man continued watching her in silence. Outside, snow battered violently against the carriage windows while the horses shifted impatiently in the storm. Then finally, his deep voice broke the darkness between them. "You entered the wrong carriage." Heat flooded Elena's face despite the cold. "I'm so sorry, sir. I thought." Her words disappeared as the carriage suddenly lurched forward. Elena grabbed the seat beside her to steady herself. "Wait," she whispered, panic rising fast inside her chest. "Please stop. I can get out here." The stranger's expression did not change. "If you step outside now," he said quietly, "you will freeze before you make it half a mile." Lightning flashed beyond the glass, illuminating his face for the briefest moment. A scar traced faintly along his jawline before darkness swallowed him again. Elena's pulse quickened. Every child in Blackwood County knew the stories whispered about the master of Blackthorne Hall, the widowed duke who no longer attended society gatherings, the man who buried himself inside a stone mansion after his wife's death and emerged colder with every passing year. And now she sat trapped inside his carriage while the storm sealed the world shut behind them. Sebastian Whitmore watched the frightened young woman clutching her suitcase with white knuckles, her snow-covered coat dripping onto the polished floorboards of the carriage. She looked exhausted, lost, far too fragile for a night like this. He should have ordered the driver to leave her behind. Instead, his eyes drifted briefly toward the storm outside before returning to her pale face. "You may stay until morning," he said at last, his voice distant as winter itself. "After that, Miss, whatever your name is, you will leave my world exactly as quietly as you entered it." The carriage continued through the storm for nearly an hour, its wheels groaning against the frozen road while snow battered endlessly against the windows. Elena sat perfectly still across from Sebastian Whitmore, her damp gloves folded tightly in her lap, as warmth slowly returned to her numb fingers. The silence between them felt heavier than the winter sky itself. Every now and then lightning illuminated the interior of the carriage in brief silver flashes, revealing the hard line of the Duke's jaw and the distant expression in his cold gray eyes. He had not looked away from the storm once. Elena tried not to stare at him, though it was impossible not to feel the weight of his presence. Men like Sebastian Whitmore existed in newspapers and whispered conversations, not inches away inside dark carriages on forgotten roads. She remembered hearing women speak about him in low voices at boarding houses and train stations. The Duke of Blackthorne, the widower who buried himself inside his northern estate after tragedy hollowed out his life. Some claimed he no longer smiled. Others swore the old mansion itself had become cursed after the death of his wife. Looking at him now, Elena almost believed every story. "You should remove your gloves before your hands stiffen completely," he said suddenly, his deep voice cutting through the endless sound of the storm. Elena blinked in surprise before quickly obeying. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled the wet fabric away. Sebastian's gaze flickered briefly toward her reddened hands before returning to the dark window beside him. "You traveled alone in weather like this?" he asked. "I did not intend to," Elena admitted quietly. "The storm worsened faster than expected, and still you continued." There was no judgment in his tone, only observation. Elena lowered her eyes toward the suitcase resting beside her boots. Sometimes continuing is the only option left. For the first time since she entered the carriage, Sebastian looked directly at her. Something unreadable passed behind his expression before he leaned back into the shadows once more. The horses slowed gradually as iron gates emerged through the snow ahead, towering nearly 15 feet high beneath twisted black trees. Elena stared through the frosted glass as the carriage rolled forward between stone pillars crowned with weather-worn angels. Beyond them stood Blackthorne Hall. Her breath caught softly in her throat. The mansion rose from the hills like something carved from the storm itself, enormous and silent beneath the falling snow. Tall Gothic windows glimmered faintly with candlelight, while ivy climbed the dark stone walls like reaching fingers. Several towers disappeared into the swirling white sky above. Even from a distance, the house carried an unmistakable sadness, as though grief itself lived inside those walls. The carriage stopped beneath the massive front entrance where lanterns flickered weakly against the wind. Before Elena could reach for the handle, Sebastian stepped out first and extended a gloved hand toward her without a word. She hesitated only briefly before placing her fingers in his. His grip was firm and steady, warm despite the freezing air around them. The moment her boots touched the ground, a violent gust of wind swept across the courtyard, nearly stealing her breath entirely. Sebastian instinctively moved closer, shielding her from the storm with the broad frame of his coat as they climbed the stone steps together. The front doors opened before they reached them. An older butler stood waiting inside, his silver hair immaculate despite the late hour. Yet the moment his eyes landed on Elena, genuine surprise crossed his composed features. "Your Grace," he said carefully. "I was not aware we were expecting a guest." "Neither was I," Sebastian replied coldly as he removed his gloves. Warmth surrounded Elena the instant she stepped inside the entrance hall, though the vast space before her still sent a chill across her skin. Marble floors reflected dim candlelight beneath towering ceilings lined with dark wooden beams. Long shadows stretched across the walls where enormous portraits watched silently from gilded frames. Somewhere deeper inside the mansion, an old clock echoed through the halls with hollow precision. Elena slowly turned toward the grand staircase rising through the center of the entrance hall, and that was when she saw it. At the very top stood a small little girl in a pale blue nightgown, no older than 7 years old. She clutched a worn porcelain doll tightly against her chest, while golden curls fell softly around her pale face. The child did not move, did not blink. She simply stared at Elena with enormous gray eyes identical to her father's. The entire hall seemed to still around that silent gaze. Sebastian followed Elena's eyes upward. His expression darkened almost instantly. "Clara," he said quietly, "you should be asleep." The little girl said nothing. She only tightened her fingers around the doll before disappearing slowly into the shadows beyond the staircase railing. Elena watched the empty hallway above long after the child vanished. Then Sebastian's low voice reached her once more, quieter this time. "My daughter has not spoken a single word in 2 years." The old clock continued echoing through Blackthorne Hall long after the little girl disappeared into the darkness above the staircase. Elena could still feel the weight of those silent gray eyes lingering in the air around her. For a strange moment, the child had not looked frightened of her at all, only curious. Sebastian removed his coat slowly while snow melted from the dark wool onto the marble floor beneath him. "Mrs. Holloway will prepare a room for you," he said without looking at Elena. "You may remain here until the roads reopen." The butler standing nearby hesitated almost imperceptibly. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "the storm has worsened considerably. The bridge near Hollow Creek collapsed less than an hour ago." Silence followed his words. Sebastian's jaw tightened faintly before he turned toward the towering windows where snow continued swallowing the world beyond the glass. "How long?" he asked. "Possibly several days." Elena immediately lowered her eyes. "I do not wish to impose longer than necessary." Sebastian finally looked at her again, his expression unreadable beneath the flickering chandelier light. "The storm does not care about convenience, Miss Vale." His voice remained calm, cold, controlled, yet something about the exhaustion beneath it unsettled her more than anger would have. Mrs. Holloway soon appeared from one of the western corridors, a kindly older woman with silver pinned neatly beneath a dark lace cap. Unlike the others, she smiled softly when she approached Elena. "You must be frozen through, dear," she said gently. "Come with me before you catch your death." Elena offered a quiet thank you before following her across the enormous entrance hall. Her footsteps echoed softly against marble as she passed beneath portraits of stern-faced ancestors watching from gold frames darkened with age. The deeper they moved into the mansion, the quieter everything became. Blackthorne Hall did not feel abandoned. It felt paused, like a house holding its breath. Thick velvet curtains concealed most of the moonlight, while rows of candles flickered weakly against endless stone walls. Elena noticed several grandfather clocks lining the hallways, yet none of them moved. Their hands remained frozen at different hours as if time itself had stopped inside the estate years ago. "Most of the east wing remains closed now," Mrs. Holloway explained quietly as they climbed a curved staircase. "The Duke prefers it that way." Elena glanced toward a distant corridor swallowed almost entirely by shadow. White sheets covered the furniture there like sleeping ghosts. "This house feels very sad," she admitted softly before she could stop herself. Mrs. Holloway slowed slightly. For a brief second, genuine sorrow crossed the older woman's face. It was not always. They reached the guest chamber at the far end of the northern hall. Mrs. Holloway pushed the door open, revealing a beautiful room warmed by a crackling fireplace. Pale gold curtains framed tall windows overlooking the snow-covered cliffs beyond the estate, while candlelight danced gently across polished oak furniture. Elena stepped inside carefully, almost afraid to disturb the quiet beauty surrounding her. "There are fresh clothes in the wardrobe," Mrs. Holloway said kindly. "I had one of the maids prepare them quickly." Elena turned in surprise. "That was very thoughtful. Blackthorne Hall has seen enough sorrow, dear. Kindness should not disappear with it." The older woman offered one last smile before quietly leaving Elena alone. The moment the door closed, silence settled over the room once more. Elena moved slowly toward the fire, extending trembling hands toward the warmth while exhaustion finally crashed through her body all at once. Her reflection stared back at her faintly through the dark window glass. Damp hair, tired eyes, a woman with nowhere left to belong. She closed her eyes briefly. Then something caught her attention. Across the hallway beyond her partially open door stood another door slightly ajar. Soft candlelight flickered within the darkened room beyond it. Before Elena could think better of it, she stepped quietly into the corridor. The mansion remained silent around her as she approached the doorway. Then she saw it. A massive portrait draped entirely in black fabric stood at the center of the room, like a memorial untouched by time. Fresh white roses rested beneath it. The air smelled faintly of dust and candle wax. Elena moved closer slowly, her pulse strangely uneven. Who had she been? The woman whose absence still haunted every corner of this house. Almost without thinking, Elena reached trembling fingers toward the dark veil covering the portrait. "Do not touch that." Sebastian's voice shattered the silence behind her. Elena turned sharply, her breath catching hard in her throat. He stood several feet away in the dim corridor light, one hand clenched tightly at his side, while shadows hollowed the sharp lines of his face. For the first time since meeting him, something dangerous flickered behind his cold gray eyes. Not anger alone. Pain. Elena's hand fell immediately from the dark veil as Sebastian stepped fully into the room. Candlelight flickered across the sharp planes of his face, catching briefly against the faint scar near his jaw, while shadows gathered beneath his eyes like bruises left behind by sleepless years. The silence between them thickened instantly. Heavy, breathless. Elena lowered her gaze at once. "I apologize," she said softly. "I did not mean to intrude." Sebastian said nothing for several seconds. Wind rattled faintly against the distant windows while the candles burned low around the draped portrait, standing silently between them. Finally, he moved past her without another word and adjusted one of the white roses beneath the portrait with careful precision. The gesture unsettled Elena more than anger would have. It was too gentle, too practiced. "Her name was Evelyn," he said quietly, still facing away from her. Elena looked up in surprise. Sebastian's broad shoulders remained rigid beneath his black shirt as he stared at the covered portrait. She loved this room because the morning light reached here first. His voice had changed. The coldness was still there, but softer now somehow, buried beneath something deeper. "Older. After she died, I closed it." Elena's chest tightened unexpectedly. The entire house suddenly made sense to her. The silent clocks, the empty halls, the suffocating stillness hanging inside every room like dust. Blackthorne Hall was not haunted by death. It was haunted by grief that had never been allowed to breathe. "I should return to my room," Elena whispered carefully. Sebastian finally turned toward her. For one brief moment, exhaustion flickered openly across his face before his expression hardened once more. "Yes," he said quietly. "You should." Elena nodded and stepped past him into the dark hallway. Yet as she reached the doorway, his voice stopped her again. "Miss Vale." She turned slowly. His gray eyes lingered on her with unsettling intensity. "Do not wander this house at night." The words sounded less like a command and more like a warning. Elena returned to her guest room moments later with her pulse still uneven beneath her ribs. She closed the door softly behind her and leaned against it. For a moment, trying to steady herself. The fire crackled warmly nearby, yet the mansion's sadness clung to her skin like winter air. She could still picture the way Sebastian had touched those roses. Not like a duke protecting a memory, like a man terrified of losing it completely. Sleep came slowly. Wind continued roaring across the cliffs outside while shadows shifted against the walls in the dim candlelight. At some point after midnight, Elena awoke suddenly to the faint sound of footsteps somewhere beyond her room. Soft, uneven. She sat upright immediately, listening carefully. Another sound followed. A quiet creak from the hallway floorboards. Then silence. Pulling her robe tighter around herself, Elena rose cautiously and opened her door just enough to peer into the dark corridor. Candlelight flickered weakly from a nearby wall sconce, illuminating the small figure standing alone near the staircase. Clara. The little girl stood barefoot in her pale nightgown, clutching the porcelain doll tightly against her chest while moonlight silvered her golden curls. She looked terribly small beneath the towering ceilings of Blackthorne Hall. Elena stepped forward slowly. "Clara." The child did not answer. Her gray eyes remained fixed somewhere toward the lower floor of the mansion. Elena followed her gaze and noticed something then. The sound of piano music drifting faintly through the darkness below. Slow, fragile notes echoing softly through the sleeping halls. Clara's tiny fingers tightened around the doll before she quietly turned and walked toward the staircase. Elena hesitated only briefly before following several steps behind. The piano melody grew clearer as they descended into the grand lower corridor. Candlelight trembled across marble columns while shadows stretched endlessly around them. Then Elena saw him. Sebastian sat alone inside the enormous music room, one hand resting against the piano keys while the other remained motionless beside a crystal glass untouched near his elbow. He did not notice them immediately. His gaze remained fixed somewhere beyond the dark windows as he played with quiet precision, each note carrying a loneliness so profound it seemed to fill the entire room. Clara stopped in the doorway without making a sound. Elena glanced down at the child beside her and froze softly. Tears shimmered silently in the little girl's gray eyes. Not fear, not sadness alone. Recognition. As though the music belonged to a memory she still could not let go of. Then suddenly, one fragile note broke beneath Sebastian's trembling hand. The music stopped. Silence swallowed the room once more. Slowly, Sebastian lifted his eyes toward the doorway. And for the first time since Elena entered Blackthorne Hall, she saw something inside him crack. The silence after the final piano note seemed to spread through Blackthorne Hall like smoke. Sebastian remained motionless at the grand piano, one hand still resting lightly against the ivory keys, while candlelight flickered across his profile. Clara stood frozen beside Elena in the doorway, clutching the porcelain doll so tightly that the small fabric sleeve bent beneath her fingers. For several long seconds, no one moved. Then Sebastian slowly rose from the piano bench. The movement was graceful but heavy somehow, like a man carrying years on his shoulders instead of merely a dark wool shirt. His gray eyes settled first on Clara. Something softened inside them instantly. Not enough to erase the sadness there, but enough to reveal the father beneath the duke. "You should be asleep," he said quietly. Clara lowered her eyes at once. The child never answered. Sebastian's gaze shifted slowly toward Elena next. The warmth vanished almost immediately, replaced by the guarded expression she had already begun recognizing. "And you," he said softly, "have ignored my instructions twice in one night." Elena should have apologized again. Any sensible guest would have. Yet standing there beneath the trembling candlelight with Clara pressed silently against her side, she found herself answering honestly instead. "I heard the music." Sebastian's jaw tightened faintly. "That does not explain why my daughter is awake at midnight." Elena glanced down toward Clara before speaking carefully. She was alone in the hallway. Something unreadable flickered behind Sebastian's eyes then. Guilt, perhaps, or frustration directed entirely at himself. He walked slowly toward them, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble floor while the storm continued howling faintly outside the mansion walls. Clara stiffened slightly when he stopped beside her, though she did not step away. Sebastian looked down at the child for a long moment before kneeling carefully in front of her. The sight startled Elena more than she expected. Men like Sebastian Whitmore did not kneel easily. "You should not wander the house alone," he told Clara quietly. The little girl stared silently at the floorboards between them. Sebastian exhaled slowly through his nose before reaching out to adjust the loose sleeve hanging from her tiny shoulder. The movement was awkward, gentle, but unfamiliar, as though affection itself had become something fragile in his hands. "Come," he said softly. "I will take you upstairs." Clara hesitated. Then slowly, almost uncertainly, her small fingers reached for his hand. Elena felt her chest tighten unexpectedly as Sebastian froze for the briefest second before carefully curling his gloved fingers around his daughter's. Clara had not touched him first, not once since Elena arrived. Sebastian looked up then, directly at Elena. Candlelight caught the exhaustion beneath his eyes again, but this time there was something else there too. Something dangerously close to vulnerability. "Good night, Miss Vale." His voice had lost some of its coldness. Elena nodded softly. "Good night, Your Grace." She watched them disappear slowly into the shadows of the grand staircase together. Father and daughter, two lonely souls moving through the same darkness while standing miles apart from one another. The next morning arrived buried beneath heavy gray skies and endless snowfall. Elena woke to the sound of wind pressing against the tall windows beside her bed while pale winter light filtered weakly through the curtains. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the silence of Blackthorne Hall settled around her once more. After dressing, Elena stepped cautiously into the hallway and followed the faint smell of coffee drifting from somewhere below. The mansion felt different in daylight, no less sorrowful, only quieter somehow, as though the house itself feared disturbing old memories. Elena found Mrs. Holloway arranging breakfast inside a sunlit dining room overlooking the cliffs. "Good morning, dear," the older woman greeted warmly. "Did you sleep at all?" "A little." Elena offered a faint smile before glancing around the nearly empty room. Does the Duke always wake before sunrise? Mrs. Holloway paused briefly while pouring tea. The Duke does not sleep very much. Before Elena could respond, footsteps echoed suddenly from the corridor outside. Sebastian entered the room moments later dressed entirely in black once again, his expression distant and composed. Yet the instant Clara appeared quietly behind him, Elena noticed something strange. The little girl's eyes lifted immediately toward her. Not toward her father. Toward Elena. Sebastian noticed it too. His gaze lingered briefly on his daughter before returning slowly to Elena's face. Something guarded settled over his features again at once. The roads remain closed, he said quietly while removing his gloves. It seems Blackthorne Hall will be your prison a little longer, Miss Vale. Elena met his cold gray eyes steadily for the first time since arriving. Then perhaps, she answered softly. It does not need to feel like one. For the first time in years, Sebastian Whitmore forgot to look away first. Snow continued falling over Blackthorne Hall for 3 more days, without mercy. The cliffs beyond the mansion vanished beneath endless white, while icy wind rattled against the tall windows from morning until long after midnight. Inside the estate, time moved strangely. Quietly, Elena slowly began noticing the rhythms hidden beneath the silence of the house. Mrs. Holloway humming softly while arranging fresh flowers no one seemed to notice. The old butler polishing silver in the western hall every evening at precisely 7 o'clock. The distant sound of Sebastian's footsteps crossing the library floor long after the rest of the mansion had gone dark. And always Clara, watching, waiting. The little girl appeared beside Elena more often now, though she still never spoke. Sometimes Elena would find her sitting silently near the drawing-room fireplace with the porcelain doll resting in her lap, while snow drifted softly beyond the windows behind her. Other times she lingered quietly in doorways, her gray eyes following Elena through the halls with careful curiosity. Yet she never approached first. It was always Elena who crossed the distance between them. On the 4th morning, Elena entered the conservatory shortly after breakfast and stopped immediately in surprise. Clara sat alone near the enormous frosted windows, surrounded by scattered colored pencils and blank sheets of paper. Pale winter sunlight filtered softly through the glass ceiling above her, turning her golden curls almost silver beneath the light. Elena hesitated near the doorway. "May I join you?" Clara's small fingers tightened slightly around one of the pencils. Then, after a moment, she gave the faintest nod. Elena crossed the room carefully and sat beside her at the small wooden table. Neither of them spoke. The quiet between them did not feel uncomfortable somehow, only fragile. Elena glanced toward the paper resting beneath Clara's hand and noticed the child had drawn the outline of Blackthorne Hall in careful charcoal lines. Every window was dark, every tower empty. "You are very talented," Elena said softly. Clara lowered her eyes immediately, though Elena noticed a faint trace of pink touch the child's pale cheeks. Then slowly, almost uncertainly, Clara pushed another blank piece of paper toward her. Elena blinked in surprise. "You want me to draw too?" Clara nodded once. Elena smiled gently before picking up one of the pencils. "I should warn you," she whispered. "I am terrible at it." For the first time since arriving at Blackthorne Hall, Elena heard it. A tiny sound, soft and breathless. Not quite laughter, but close enough to make her heart ache. "Miss Vale." Sebastian's voice cut quietly through the conservatory from behind them. Elena turned immediately. He stood near the entrance dressed in a dark wool coat dusted lightly with snow, leather gloves still covering his hands as cold winter air drifted faintly through the open doorway behind him. His gray eyes moved first toward Clara, then toward the papers scattered across the table. Elena watched genuine surprise flicker across his face before he concealed it quickly beneath his usual restraint. Clara had not drawn in nearly 2 years. Mrs. Holloway had whispered that truth to Elena only the evening before. Sebastian stepped slowly into the room. The atmosphere shifted immediately around him, not through cruelty or anger, but through sheer presence alone. Powerful, controlled, dangerous in the quietest way. Yet Clara did not retreat from the table this time. She remained seated beside Elena with the colored pencils still resting near her small hands. Sebastian noticed that too. "The bridge will not be repaired until tomorrow at the earliest," he said calmly, while removing one glove finger by finger. "The roads remain unsafe." Elena set the pencil down gently. Then I remain your unwilling guest another day. Something almost invisible touched the corner of Sebastian's mouth before disappearing again. You say that as though Blackthorne Hall is unbearable. Elena looked toward the frost-covered windows surrounding them. No, she admitted quietly. Only lonely. Silence followed her words. Heavy. Clara lowered her gaze to the table immediately, while Sebastian remained completely still near the doorway. Elena realized too late what she had said, but when she looked back at him, there was no anger in his face. Only exhaustion. The kind carried by people who had spent too long pretending they no longer needed warmth. Sebastian's eyes drifted slowly toward his daughter once more. Clara had begun sketching again silently beside Elena, tiny fingers moving carefully across the page, while winter light wrapped softly around her small frame. For several long seconds, Sebastian simply watched her. Then his voice lowered almost to a whisper. She has not sat in this room since Evelyn died. Elena felt her breath catch softly. Sebastian continued staring at Clara without looking at her. Every governess before you lasted less than a month, he said quietly. Some feared the silence. Others feared me. Finally, his gray eyes lifted toward Elena again. Dark. Searching. You do not seem afraid of either. Elena held his gaze steadily despite the sudden tension tightening the air between them. Perhaps, she answered softly, because I think silence usually hides pain, not monsters. Something inside Sebastian Whitmore shifted then. Small. Dangerous. The kind of crack that appears in frozen lakes moments before the ice finally breaks. That evening, the storm finally began to weaken. Snow still drifted steadily beyond the towering windows of Blackthorne Hall, but the violent wind that had haunted the estate for days softened into a distant whisper against the cliffs. Warm candlelight glowed throughout the mansion while servants quietly prepared for the possibility that the roads might reopen by morning. Elena stood beside the library fireplace after dinner with a book resting unopened in her hands. She had tried reading the same page 3 times without understanding a single sentence. Her thoughts kept drifting elsewhere. To Clara's tiny, almost laugh inside the conservatory. To the way Sebastian had looked at his daughter afterward, as though he no longer recognized the silence surrounding his own child. Most of all, her thoughts returned to the strange loneliness hidden beneath his controlled expression. A man could not grieve this deeply unless he had once loved with his entire soul. The realization unsettled her more than it should have. Miss Vale. Elena turned at once as Mrs. Holloway hurried into the library, genuine worry crossing the older woman's face. It is Clara. Elena immediately set the book aside. What happened? She has taken ill. Fear tightened instantly inside Elena's chest as she followed Mrs. Holloway quickly through the dim corridors of Blackthorne Hall. The mansion seemed darker tonight somehow, the flickering wall sconces casting long shadows across the stone floors while distant thunder rolled faintly beyond the cliffs. They reached Clara's room moments later. Elena stepped inside and stopped immediately. Sebastian stood beside the child's bed, one hand braced against the carved wooden bedpost while Clara lay trembling beneath heavy blankets, her cheeks flushed with fever. Several untouched cups of tea rested nearby along with folded cloths already cooled from repeated use. Sebastian looked up sharply when Elena entered. For the first time since she met him, the control in his expression had fractured completely. Her fever keeps rising, he said quietly. His voice sounded rough. Exhausted. The doctor cannot reach the estate until morning. Elena crossed the room without hesitation and knelt beside the bed. Clara's tiny fingers trembled weakly against the blankets while soft, uneven breaths escaped her pale lips. Elena pressed the back of her hand gently against the child's forehead and immediately felt the heat burning through her skin. She needs cool water changed frequently, Elena said softly while brushing damp curls away from Clara's face. And someone must stay with her. I have stayed, Sebastian replied at once. Elena looked up then and saw it clearly. He had not changed clothes since morning. Shadows darkened the skin beneath his gray eyes while exhaustion hollowed the sharp lines of his face. He looked terrified, not like a duke, not like a powerful man feared across the county. Only a father standing helpless beside the only thing left in his world. When did she last sleep peacefully? Elena asked gently. Sebastian's jaw tightened. She wakes every hour. Elena reached for one of the cloths resting nearby, and dipped it into fresh, cool water before carefully placing it against Clara's forehead. The little girl stirred faintly beneath the blankets. "You should rest for a while," Elena whispered without looking up. "She needs calm around her." Sebastian stared at her in silence. "And you believe she finds calm with you?" Elena hesitated only briefly before answering honestly. "I think she feels less alone." Something painful crossed Sebastian's face then. So quickly most people would have missed it entirely. But Elena saw, because loneliness recognized itself too easily in others. Hours passed quietly inside the candlelit room while the storm faded beyond the windows. Mrs. Holloway eventually retired downstairs while Sebastian remained seated near the fireplace in complete silence, watching every movement Elena made beside Clara's bed. Sometimes Elena could feel his gaze lingering on her longer than necessary before he looked away again. Near midnight, Clara finally stirred weakly against the pillows. Elena immediately leaned closer. "Clara." The child's fever-bright eyes opened slowly. For several fragile seconds, she looked disoriented by the flickering candlelight around her. Then her small trembling hand reached weakly across the blankets. Not toward her father, toward Elena. Sebastian froze completely in the chair beside the fireplace. Elena gently took Clara's hand between both of hers. "I am here," she whispered softly. Clara's tiny fingers curled tightly around hers before the child drifted back into restless sleep once more. Silence swallowed the room again afterward. Heavy breathing. Elena slowly looked up. Sebastian had not moved. Firelight flickered across his face, while something raw and shaken burned openly inside his gray eyes. He stared at Elena's hand, still holding Clara's, as though witnessing something impossible. Then finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sebastian rose quietly from his chair and crossed the room toward them. Elena expected him to speak. Instead, he stopped beside the bed and gently pulled the blanket higher around Clara's shoulders with trembling fingers. The movement was painfully careful. Then his hand brushed Elena's for the briefest moment above the blankets. Warm, unsteady, human. Sebastian's voice lowered almost to a whisper. "She has not reached for anyone since her mother died." Morning arrived beneath pale silver light spilling softly across Clara's bedroom windows. The storm had finally loosened its grip on Blackthorne Hall, though snow still blanketed the cliffs in endless white beyond the glass. Elena had fallen asleep sometime near dawn beside Clara's bed with one hand still loosely wrapped around the child's smaller one. She woke slowly to the faint crackling of the fireplace and the unfamiliar sensation of warmth resting across her shoulders. Elena blinked in confusion before realizing a heavy wool blanket had been carefully draped around her sometime during the night. Her breath caught softly. Sebastian. The realization settled, strangely deep inside her chest. Clara still slept peacefully against the pillows. Her fever finally reduced while sunlight touched her pale cheeks with soft color once more. Relief flooded Elena, so suddenly she closed her eyes briefly in gratitude. Then she noticed Sebastian standing near the far window. He had not realized she was awake yet. One hand rested against the cold glass while snowlight outlined his tall frame in pale gray shadows. He looked exhausted beyond words, yet somehow lighter too. As though the terror of losing his daughter had cracked something open inside him that could no longer be hidden behind silence and control. Elena slowly rose from the chair, without disturbing Clara. The movement caught Sebastian's attention immediately. He turned toward her at once, his gray eyes moving first toward his sleeping daughter before settling on Elena's face. "Her fever broke an hour ago," he said quietly. Elena glanced toward Clara and smiled softly. "That is good news." Sebastian studied her for a long moment. "You stayed all night." She should not have awakened alone. Something flickered behind his expression again. That same dangerous softness she kept seeing before he buried it quickly beneath restraint. "Most people grow uncomfortable around silence," he said quietly. "You seem to understand it instead." Elena lowered her eyes briefly. "Silence was common in my home after my father became ill." Sebastian's gaze sharpened slightly. "You cared for him alone?" "There was no one else." The words escaped more honestly than she intended. For several seconds, Sebastian remained perfectly still beside the window. Then quietly, almost carefully, he asked, "And who cared for you afterward?" Elena looked at him then. Truly looked at him. The question itself felt unfamiliar somehow, like something no one had asked her in years. She tried to answer lightly. Life does not pause long enough for grief. But Sebastian's eyes did not leave her face. He understood that answer far too well. Before either of them could speak again, a soft knock interrupted the fragile stillness between them. Mrs. Holloway entered carrying fresh tea and paused immediately upon seeing Clara still sleeping peacefully. Genuine relief filled her face. "Thank heavens," she whispered softly. Then her expression shifted slightly as she looked toward Sebastian. "Your Grace, there is another matter." Sebastian straightened instantly. The warmth vanished from his features with practiced ease. "What is it?" Mrs. Holloway hesitated. "Several guests arrived unexpectedly this morning." Elena felt the atmosphere inside the room tighten immediately. "Guests?" Sebastian's jaw hardened faintly. "Who?" "Lady Beatrice Ashcombe among them." Silence followed. Even Mrs. Holloway seemed uneasy speaking the name aloud. Elena glanced toward Sebastian in confusion and saw something cold settle fully back into his eyes once more. "I was not informed anyone planned to visit Blackthorne Hall," he said quietly. "Apparently the road's reopening encouraged society's curiosity," Mrs. Holloway answered carefully. "They are currently waiting in the drawing room." Sebastian looked briefly toward Clara sleeping peacefully in bed before exhaling slowly through his nose. "Very well." His voice became distant again, controlled. The Duke returning where the father had briefly disappeared. He moved toward the doorway before pausing beside Elena. "You should remain upstairs until they leave." Elena frowned slightly. "Why?" Sebastian's gaze darkened almost imperceptibly. "Because people like Lady Beatrice survive on cruelty disguised as politeness." Elena felt something stubborn rise quietly inside her chest. "I have survived worse things than unkind women." For the briefest second, Sebastian almost smiled. Not fully, never fully, but enough to transform something in his face so unexpectedly that Elena forgot to breathe. Then the expression vanished as quickly as it came. "That," he said softly, "is exactly what worries me." Hours later, Elena stood alone near the upper balcony overlooking the grand drawing room below. She had not intended to disobey Sebastian. Yet curiosity pulled her silently toward the voices echoing through the mansion halls. Below, several elegantly dressed guests gathered around the fireplace beneath glittering chandeliers while servants poured tea with careful precision. At the center stood Lady Beatrice Ashcombe. Beautiful, wealthy, sharp as shattered glass beneath silk gloves and diamonds. Elena immediately recognized the type of woman she was. The kind who smiled while searching for weakness. Sebastian stood across from her near the mantel, dressed entirely in black once again. Reserved, distant, untouchable. Yet Elena noticed something strange immediately. Lady Beatrice kept trying to move closer to him, while Sebastian subtly stepped farther away each time. "Surely Blackthorne Hall has become unbearably lonely after all these years," Lady Beatrice purred softly. "A man cannot remain buried in grief forever." Sebastian's expression never changed. "And yet I manage remarkably well." Several guests laughed nervously. Lady Beatrice's smile tightened slightly. Then her eyes drifted upward toward the balcony, directly toward Elena standing partially hidden in the shadows above. Silence rippled instantly through the room. Sebastian followed her gaze. The moment his gray eyes found Elena, something unreadable flashed across his face. Not anger. Something far more dangerous. Possession. The drawing room remained unnaturally silent after Lady Beatrice noticed Elena standing above them on the balcony. Candlelight shimmered across crystal glasses and polished marble, while every pair of eyes in the room slowly lifted upward toward the unknown woman lingering in Blackthorne Hall, like a secret no one had been invited to uncover. Elena immediately stepped back from the railing, realizing too late how intimate the scene below must have appeared. A mysterious young woman hidden inside the home of the most reclusive duke in the county. Society would not forgive such a thing gently. But before she could retreat fully into the shadows, Sebastian's voice cut calmly through the silence below. "Miss Vale." Elena froze. His tone remained controlled, almost indifferent, yet she could feel every guest listening carefully to the sound of her name. Slowly, she stepped forward once more. Sebastian did not look away from her. "Would you join us?" Lady Beatrice's smile stiffened almost imperceptibly. Elena descended the grand staircase moments. Later, beneath the weight of countless curious eyes, she hated how aware she suddenly became of her plain cream dress, and simple hairstyle standing among silks, jewels, and polished aristocratic perfection. Yet somehow the shame she expected never fully arrived. Because Sebastian watched her descend the staircase with such unsettling steadiness that the rest of the room seemed to disappear around them. When Elena finally reached the drawing room floor, Lady Beatrice spoke first. "So this is the unexpected guest who has captivated Blackthorne Hall." Her voice sounded sweet enough to poison tea. Elena offered a polite nod. "I fear the storm captivated me more than the estate itself." Several guests chuckled softly. Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed faintly. Sebastian crossed the room then, stopping beside Elena with deliberate calm. Not touching her. Never touching her. Yet the quiet authority of his presence beside her shifted the atmosphere instantly. "Miss Vale has been assisting with Clara's recovery," he said smoothly. "The household is grateful for her kindness." Elena glanced toward him in surprise. He had never spoken about her with warmth before. Lady Beatrice noticed too. Her jeweled fingers tightened slightly around her teacup. "How fortunate for your daughter," she replied carefully before turning toward Elena once more. "And how long do you intend to remain at Blackthorne Hall, Miss Vale?" The question carried no real politeness beneath it. Elena understood immediately. So did Sebastian. Before Elena could answer, his voice lowered quietly beside her. "As long as I wish her to." Silence fell again, thick and immediate. Several guests exchanged subtle glances over their glasses while Lady Beatrice's smile nearly cracked beneath the weight of his words. Elena's pulse quickened painfully beneath her ribs. Sebastian sounded possessive. The realization frightened her more than the cruel curiosity in the room, because part of her had begun wanting him to sound that way. Lady Beatrice recovered quickly. Women like her always did. "Of course," she said lightly. "Blackthorne Hall has been painfully empty these past years. I suppose even ghosts eventually desire company." Something cold flashed through Sebastian's eyes. "Dangerous." Elena saw it immediately. "Careful, Beatrice," he said softly. "You are standing inside my home." The room fell completely still. Lady Beatrice lowered her gaze at once. "Naturally," she murmured. No one spoke carelessly afterward. The gathering ended less than an hour later beneath strained politeness and forced smiles. By sunset, the carriages finally departed down the snow-covered cliffs, while Blackthorne Hall returned once more to silence. Elena stood near the library window afterward, watching the final carriage disappear into the fading gray light. "You should not have defended me." Sebastian's voice came quietly from behind her. Elena turned slowly. He stood near the doorway with one hand resting against the dark wood frame, exhaustion softening the sharp lines of his face now that the guests were gone. "Lady Beatrice was looking for weakness," he said simply. "I do not tolerate cruelty beneath my roof." Elena studied him carefully. "That was not why they stared at me." Sebastian said nothing. The silence itself became an answer. Elena looked away first, her fingers tightening faintly around the windowsill. "Your guests will talk." "They already talked before arriving." His voice lowered slightly. "Society survives on imagination." Elena laughed softly despite herself. "And what exactly are they imagining now?" Sebastian crossed the room slowly then, his footsteps quiet against the library floor. He stopped closer to her than propriety allowed. Not touching, never touching, yet close enough for Elena to notice the faint scent of cedar and winter lingering against his coat. "That," he said quietly, "depends entirely on whether you plan to leave tomorrow." Elena's breath caught softly, because for the first time since entering Blackthorne Hall, she realized she no longer knew the answer. Elena barely slept that night. Long after the fireplaces dimmed and the servants disappeared into the quiet corners of Blackthorne Hall, she remained awake beside the tall bedroom window watching moonlight spill across the frozen cliffs below. Sebastian's words continued echoing softly inside her mind. "That depends entirely on whether you plan to leave tomorrow." Such a simple question, yet it had unsettled her more deeply than she wished to admit. Because somewhere between Clara's silent trust and Sebastian's guarded gaze, Blackthorne Hall had begun feeling dangerously close to home. And home was the one thing Elena had already lost once before. Morning arrived cold and clear beneath pale winter sunlight. The roads had finally reopened. Servants moved throughout the mansion with renewed energy, while horses were prepared in the courtyard below. The storm was over. Elena stood quietly beside the wardrobe in her guest room, folding the last of the borrowed dresses Mrs. Holloway had so kindly provided during her stay. Her small suitcase rested open on the bed beside her. She should have felt relieved. Instead, every careful movement of her hands felt strangely heavy. A soft knock sounded at the door. "Come in," Elena said quietly. Clara stepped into the room, holding her porcelain doll tightly against her chest. The little girl's gray eyes immediately drifted toward the packed suitcase resting on the bed. Elena's chest tightened painfully at the sight. "Good morning," she whispered gently. Clara did not answer. She rarely did. Instead, she crossed the room slowly and stopped beside the suitcase, her tiny fingers tightening around the doll's faded dress. Elena knelt carefully in front of her. "The roads are safe again," she explained softly. "I cannot stay forever." Clara lowered her gaze instantly. Silence stretched painfully between them before the child slowly reached into the pocket of her nightgown and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it carefully to Elena. Elena unfolded it slowly and felt her breath catch. It was a drawing. Blackthorne Hall beneath falling snow. Clara stood, footsteps appeared in the hallway outside. Sebastian stopped in the doorway moments later. His eyes moved first toward Clara, then toward the drawing resting in Elena's trembling hands. Something shifted immediately in his expression. Clara looked at her father only briefly before quietly retreating from the room without a word, leaving silence behind her once more. Sebastian remained standing near the doorway for several long seconds after she disappeared. "She has not written anything for anyone since Evelyn died," he said quietly. Elena carefully folded the drawing again, her fingers trembling faintly. "I did not ask her to." "I know." His voice lowered slightly. "That is why it matters." Neither of them moved. Winter sunlight spilled softly across the room, while distant winds whispered faintly against the cliffs beyond the windows. Elena finally forced herself to look toward the packed suitcase resting on the bed. "The carriage should leave before dark if I hope to reach town safely." Sebastian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. But he did not move toward the suitcase, did not call for servants, did not speak another word encouraging her departure. Instead, his gray eyes remained fixed quietly on her face with something dangerously close to conflict burning beneath his restraint. Elena looked away first. "This place does not need more rumors because of me. I do not care about rumors." The answer came too quickly, too honestly. Silence followed immediately afterward. Sebastian seemed to realize it too. He exhaled slowly through his nose before stepping farther into the room. "What I care about," he said quietly, "is what happens when you leave." Elena's pulse stumbled painfully. "You barely know me. That has not stopped this house from changing around you." His gaze drifted briefly toward Clara's drawing still resting in Elena's hands. "Or my daughter." His voice roughened slightly then. Softer. More dangerous because of it. "Or me." Elena's breath caught hard enough to hurt. For one terrifying moment, she thought he might step closer. Thought she might let him. But before either of them could speak again, the sharp sound of carriage wheels echoed suddenly through the courtyard below. Sebastian's expression darkened immediately. Another visitor. Mrs. Holloway appeared moments later outside the partially open doorway, looking unusually pale. "Your Grace," she said carefully. "A gentleman from Hartford has arrived asking for Miss Vale." Elena frowned in confusion. "For me?" Mrs. Holloway nodded hesitantly. "He claims to represent the creditors handling your late father's estate." The color drained instantly from Elena's face. Sebastian noticed immediately. Every trace of softness vanished from his expression at once. Not because he stopped caring, because suddenly he cared far too much. Elena felt cold long before she reached the drawing room downstairs. Not the sharp winter cold blowing across the cliffs outside Blackthorne Hall, but the quieter kind that settled beneath the skin when old fears returned without warning. Sebastian walked beside her through the dim corridor in complete silence, his expression unreadable once more beneath the controlled mask he wore before the world. Yet Elena noticed something different now. His silence no longer felt distant. It felt dangerous, protective. The drawing room doors stood partially open ahead of them. Inside, a tall man dressed in a charcoal overcoat waited beside the fireplace holding several leather documents beneath one arm. He turned immediately as Elena entered, and his expression shifted visibly with relief. "Miss Vale." Elena stopped several feet away. "Mr. Hargrove." Sebastian's gray eyes moved carefully between them. "You know this gentleman?" Unfortunately, Elena answered quietly. Mr. Hargrove removed his gloves with practiced politeness while glancing uneasily toward Sebastian. I apologize for arriving unannounced, Your Grace, but the matter is urgent. Sebastian remained near Elena's side. Then I suggest you explain it quickly. The temperature inside the room seemed to drop several degrees. Mr. Hargrove swallowed almost visibly before turning back toward Elena. There are additional debts connected to your late father's estate. Elena's stomach tightened immediately. That is impossible. I settled everything after the house was sold. Most of it, he corrected carefully. But a private lender recently surfaced with documentation proving another outstanding balance. Elena stared at him in disbelief. How much? Mr. Hargrove hesitated. Nearly $15,000. The number hit her like ice water. 15,000. Her father could never have borrowed such a sum responsibly. She suddenly understood why Mr. Hargrove looked so uncomfortable standing inside Blackthorne Hall. This was not merely debt anymore. It was ruin. There must be some mistake, Elena whispered softly. I reviewed every record myself. The lender claims your father signed shortly before his death. Mr. Hargrove lowered his voice slightly. Miss Vale, if payment cannot be arranged, legal action will begin immediately. Elena's hands trembled faintly at her sides. She had nothing left to lose except the little dignity she still possessed. No home, no inheritance, no future secure enough even to defend herself properly. Shame rose hot and painful inside her chest. Sebastian had been silent the entire time. Too silent. Elena finally forced herself to speak before the silence crushed her completely. Thank you for informing me. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. I will leave this afternoon and arrange what I can. Sebastian turned toward her sharply. Leave? Elena avoided his eyes. This is my problem, not yours. Mr. Hargrove looked between them uneasily. Sebastian stepped forward then, slow and deliberate, until he stood directly beside Elena once more. How much did you say? He asked quietly. Mr. Hargrove immediately straightened. 15,000, Your Grace. Sebastian nodded once. It will be settled by tomorrow morning. Elena stared at him in shock. No, the word escaped instantly, sharp enough to surprise even herself. Sebastian looked down at her calmly. No, you cannot simply pay my debts. I can. That is not the point. Emotion cracked softly through her voice before she could stop it. I am not charity. Something fierce flashed suddenly behind Sebastian's gray eyes. Do you truly believe I would insult you that way? The room fell silent again. Elena's breath trembled unevenly in her chest while Mr. Hargrove quietly pretended not to exist near the fireplace. Sebastian stepped even closer then, close enough that his lowered voice belonged only to her now. You cared for my daughter when she was ill. His gaze did not leave hers. You brought life back into this house when I had forgotten such a thing was possible. Elena could barely breathe beneath the weight of his eyes. And still, he said quietly, you think I would stand here and watch you face this alone? The wall she had spent years building around herself began cracking apart all at once. Dangerous tears burned behind her eyes. She turned away immediately, ashamed of them. You owe me nothing. Sebastian answered so softly, she almost missed it entirely. That is where you are wrong. Silence trembled between them. Heavy, breathing, real. Finally, Sebastian looked toward Mr. Hargrove once more. You may inform the lender the debt will be resolved within 24 hours. Mr. Hargrove nodded quickly. Of course, Your Grace. He gathered his papers almost immediately afterward and hurried from the drawing room with visible relief, leaving Elena and Sebastian alone beside the fire. Neither spoke for several long seconds after the doors closed. Then Elena whispered quietly without looking at him. Why are you doing this? Sebastian's answer came slowly. Honestly, like something pulled painfully from a place he no longer knew how to protect. Because the thought of you leaving this house feels unbearable. Elena finally looked up then. Firelight flickered across Sebastian's face, while raw emotion burned openly behind the restraint he could no longer fully hide. And for the first time since entering Blackthorne Hall, Elena realized the most dangerous thing in this house was no longer grief. It was hope. Snow melted slowly along the cliffs surrounding Blackthorne Hall over the following days, revealing dark stone pathways and frozen gardens sleeping beneath winter's final breath. Yet inside the mansion, something far more dangerous had begun thawing. Elena felt it every time Sebastian's gaze lingered on her a second too long before turning away. Every time Clara quietly slipped her small hand into Elena's while walking through the endless corridors. Every time laughter almost returned to rooms that had forgotten the sound entirely. Blackthorne Hall no longer felt frozen in grief. It felt suspended on the edge of change, which was precisely why society arrived once more to destroy it. Absolutely not. Sebastian's voice cut sharply across the library as Mrs. Holloway stood nervously near the doorway, holding an elegant cream invitation sealed with gold wax. "The Winter Rose Ball has not been hosted in 6 years," she reminded carefully. "The county expects your attendance now that the roads are open again." Sebastian did not even glance at the invitation. "Then the county will survive disappointment." Elena sat quietly near the fireplace pretending to read, while Clara sketched beside her on the carpet. Yet she noticed the real reason beneath Sebastian's refusal immediately. He hated society because society remembered who he used to be before grief hollowed him apart. Mrs. Holloway hesitated before speaking more softly. "People are already whispering about Miss Vale remaining here." Silence settled heavily across the room. Sebastian's jaw tightened faintly. Elena lowered her eyes at once. There it was. The truth none of them could avoid forever. She had become a scandal simply by staying. "Then I should leave before things worsen," Elena said quietly. Clara looked up instantly from her drawing. Sebastian turned toward Elena, so sharply the movement startled even Mrs. Holloway. "No." The word came without hesitation. Elena's pulse stumbled softly. Mrs. Holloway wisely disappeared from the room moments later, leaving only silence behind. Sebastian crossed slowly toward the fireplace, while Clara watched both of them carefully from the floor. "You are not responsible for idle gossip," he said quietly. Elena forced herself to meet his eyes. "But you are." Sebastian exhaled slowly through his nose before glancing toward Clara nearby. "Would you give us a moment, sweetheart?" Clara hesitated briefly before nodding and quietly leaving the room with her sketchbook pressed against her chest. The moment the door closed behind her, the atmosphere shifted. Instantly. More intimate. More dangerous. Elena stood slowly from her chair near the fire. "You cannot keep defending me forever." Sebastian's gaze remained fixed on her face. "Watch me." The answer stole the breath from her lungs. He stepped closer then. Not enough to touch her. Never enough. Yet close enough for Elena to feel the heat of him beneath the soft crackling of the fire. "Do you know why I stopped hosting the Winter Rose Ball after Evelyn died?" he asked quietly. Elena shook her head once. Sebastian looked toward the dark windows beyond the library. "Because every room felt empty without her in it." His voice lowered slightly, roughened with honesty. "And because I realized how cruel people become whenever they witness sorrow they do not understand." Elena's chest ached listening to him. "Sebastian." It was the first time she had spoken his name aloud. The sound of it changed something immediately between them. His gray eyes darkened softly while silence stretched around them like held breath. "If I attend this ball," he said quietly, "they will watch you all night." Elena tried to laugh lightly despite the sudden tension in the room. "I doubt society finds me that interesting." "They will," he answered softly, "because I do." Her heart nearly stopped. The honesty in his voice felt far more dangerous than any touch could have been. Elena looked away first, shaken by the tenderness he no longer seemed capable of hiding from her. "Then perhaps I should remain upstairs during the ball." Sebastian stepped closer still. One more inch and his hand would brush hers beside the fire. "No," his voice lowered almost to a whisper. "I am tired of hiding what matters to me." Elena's breath trembled unevenly. Somewhere deep inside the mansion, the old grandfather clock began striking the hour. Slow, echoing, final. Sebastian's eyes never left her face. "The Winter Rose Ball will be held tomorrow evening," he said quietly. "And when I walk into that ballroom," his voice softened dangerously, "you will walk beside me." The Winter Rose Ball transformed Blackthorne Hall into something the estate had not resembled in years. Life. Hundreds of candles glowed against polished marble while crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across the grand ballroom below. Fresh white roses climbed the staircase railings in delicate spirals, their soft fragrance drifting through the mansion like the memory of spring after endless winter. Music echoed gently beneath the vaulted ceilings while carriages lined the snowy courtyard outside one after another, delivering the wealthiest families in Blackwood County directly into the heart of the house they once believed would remain forever buried in mourning. Yet despite the beauty surrounding her, Elena could barely steady her breathing. She stood alone near the bedroom mirror while Mrs. Holloway adjusted the final ribbon of her pale silver gown. "You look lovely, dear," the older woman whispered softly. Elena stared at her own reflection uncertainly. The gown was elegant but simple, the soft fabric shimmering faintly like moonlight against fresh snow. She hardly recognized herself. "I do not belong downstairs among those people," she admitted quietly. Mrs. Holloway smiled gently behind her. "Perhaps not." Elena turned slightly in surprise. The older woman's eyes softened warmly. "But you belong here." Before Elena could answer, a soft knock sounded at the bedroom door. Mrs. Holloway opened it moments later and stepped aside silently. Sebastian stood waiting in the corridor beyond. Elena forgot how to breathe. He wore black formal attire tailored with impossible precision, the dark fabric emphasizing the broadness of his shoulders, while silver cufflinks glimmered faintly beneath the candlelight. Yet none of that unsettled her as much as the expression in his gray eyes when he looked at her. Not cold, not distant, completely undone. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The ballroom music drifted faintly upward through the mansion, while candlelight trembled softly against the walls around them. Finally, Sebastian crossed the doorway slowly. "You are beautiful." The words were barely above a whisper, honest enough to shake her completely. Elena lowered her eyes at once, suddenly unable to withstand the intensity of his gaze. "Sebastian," he stopped directly in front of her then, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beneath the cool winter air lingering through the hallway. "You are afraid," he said quietly. Elena forced a faint smile. "You noticed." "I notice everything about you." Her heart stumbled painfully beneath her ribs. Sebastian lifted one gloved hand slowly then, as though giving her every opportunity to step away before his fingers gently brushed a loose strand of hair back from her face. The touch was impossibly careful, reverent almost. "Listen to me," he whispered softly. "No matter what is said downstairs tonight, you will never stand alone again." Elena's eyes burned suddenly with dangerous tears. Before she could answer, small footsteps echoed through the corridor behind them. Clara appeared moments later wearing a pale blue dress with white ribbons tied carefully into her curls. She stopped instantly upon seeing them standing so close together. Then slowly, shyly, the little girl smiled. A real smile. Small and uncertain, but real enough to steal the breath from both of them. Sebastian stared at his daughter in stunned silence. Clara had not smiled since Evelyn died. Elena felt Sebastian's hand tremble faintly beside her face before falling slowly back to his side. Clara crossed the hallway quietly and slipped her tiny hand into Elena's. Then, after a brief hesitation, she reached for Sebastian's too. Silence shattered inside him completely. Elena saw it happen. The walls, the grief, the endless loneliness he had wrapped around himself for years like armor. Clara looked up at her father with soft gray eyes identical to his own. Then finally, in a voice fragile from years of silence, the little girl whispered, "Papa." Sebastian stopped breathing. The entire world seemed to still around them. Clara tightened her small fingers around both their hands. "Please do not let her leave." Sebastian closed his eyes briefly as emotion finally broke openly across his face. When he looked at Elena again, there was nothing guarded left inside his gaze anymore. Only love. Quiet. Devastating. Certain. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat and removed a small silver key attached to a black ribbon. Elena stared at it in confusion. "What is this?" Sebastian gently placed the key into her trembling hand. "The East Wing." His voice lowered softly. "Evelyn once told me Blackthorne Hall never truly belonged to stone or titles." His gray eyes never left hers. It belonged to the people who brought warmth back into it. Elena's breath shook unevenly. Sebastian stepped closer one final time beneath the candlelight and softly closed her fingers around the key. "You entered my world without permission, Elena Vale." His voice nearly broke then. "And somehow you became the one thing my heart could no longer deny." Somewhere below them, the ballroom orchestra began playing a slow waltz while snow drifted gently beyond the towering windows of Blackthorne Hall. And for the first time in years, the house no longer felt haunted at all.